invite Dr. Jeff Pettis to speak to us. Jeff has already spoken about Apimondia, but for many years Jeff was head of the bee lab at Beltsville, Maryland, USDA lab, charged with looking at bee diseases and so on. And when I asked him to speak, we agreed he would talk about small hive beetle, but actually the theme of climate change has been introduced by a couple of our speakers so far, and of course, as Jeff has a president who doesn't believe that climate change exists, even when California is burning to the ground or whatever, it is a really hot topic. So it's going to be small hive beetle with a bit about climate change. So, Jeff.
All right. Thank you, Norman. Pleasure to be back with you, and I'm going to start with a few stories before I get too far into it. First of all, I'd like to thank the British Beekeepers Association, you, Norman, and Joyce for all the coordination of this meeting. It's my third time at BBKA, and it's a pleasure. It's a real casual meeting in a sense. There's a lot of good things with the trade show and stuff, so it's good to be back. I'd like to thank the sponsors as well for all the work that they do. I'm going to start with a quick story about small hive beetle, and then I'll get to a different story. So I'm just going to start with a couple of stories. The first is, if you need a really more in-depth thing about small hive beetle, look at a past issue of the Beekeepers Quarterly. And I'm going to do something I almost never do, which is read from a passage in there. It's from Jeff Ott, Beekeeping Today, USA. It's about the small hive beetle in the US. And I'll say I manage about 100 hives. Now it's only 80. You've heard about some losses in the US. But now I have about 80 hives. Every hive I have has small hive beetles, and I manage it. There's a lot of things you'll see. I'll go into the biology and all this stuff. Small hive beetle is a concern. It's an added stress. It's not going to put you out of business. So, but don't leave the lecture. I mean, it's not. So Jeff Ott says, the small hive beetle remains a persistent headache for U.S. beekeepers, affecting everyone from hobbyists to commercial operations, but to different degrees depending on their location, which is really important in the U.S. A mix of good practices such as keeping hives and apiaries clean, I'll touch a bit on that. Using traps, I'll talk about some traps for small hive beetles. Careful chemical use, I don't support any chemical use, I don't think it's necessary. And strategic honey harvesting can help manage the impact of these pests. So there is something you need to learn about honey harvesting if you ever get small hive beetles. And I'll touch on that in a minute. There's the beetle, the adult beetle. I have adult beetles in every one of my hives. And I manage them with some very simple techniques that I hope I'll get across to you. This is the larval stage. And in the larval stage, they tend to aggregate. They aggregate on your bottom board, or they aggregate in the combs. They need protein, so they feed on brood or pollen, the larval stage. And I'll get more into the biology. And I am going to talk about climate change, almost a third of the talk. So I'll briefly talk about where they were in the US, how they moved about. Life cycle, I'll spend a bit of time on the life cycle, but I'll move through it. And then, some things that affect the biology and reproduction of small hive beetle. They're sub-Saharan African. This is where they were forever and ever. I mean, we knew them, but no one even cared about small hive beetle. And then we found them in the U.S. in 96, 98. And we know for some DNA analysis, this was 96 and 98, they were found here in South Carolina and in Florida. And the genetics says we had 2 introductions. Well, if we had 2 introductions, how did they get there? Why did they get there? So there's been a lot of work done on the movement around the globe, but these are at least some of the ways that they could move around the globe. And we haven't gotten the life cycle yet, but they spend part of their life in the soil. So if you have a swarm on a ship, it could harbor small hive beetles. We've had instances where the larval stage has been in queen cages. I think that was in Portugal. There was some queens from the U.S. that came to Portugal, and they had small hive beetle larvae in them. Soil, because they spend part of their time in soil. And a recent publication by Peter Neumann and others says that they could move in unrefined wax or poorly refined wax. This is some of the way they may be coming about. And I'll go ahead and mention, you know that they're in southern Italy. So they're in Europe, but they haven't moved out of southern Italy yet. And I'll cover more of that in a minute. So this is just how fast they can spread, but it's not natural dispersal. So these are the initial states in 98, and then 99 is green, and more in 2000. And then look, by 2002, they're in all of these states, and these are suspect. And that's because every year, we move bees from all parts of the U.S. into California almost. That's the Central Valley of California. And we move about maybe up to 2 million colonies into there. So beetles are in colonies from wherever they move. The movement of the colonies for the pollination is more important than limiting the movement. It's because we also then branch out and go to apples and cherries and everything else. So there's a high demand for pollination, and the demand for pollination outstrips the need to limit something like this for small hive beetle. So it spread rapidly in the U.S. It won't do that where you don't have migratory beekeeping. The adults are in the colony, and they're trying to get access to pollen and brood, and you'll see that in a few minutes. They're about a fifth the size of an adult worker. So if they get access to brood and pollen, the larvae can develop quite rapidly, 5 to 15 days at warm temperature, if they can consume pollen or bee brood. Then they'll mass in the colony. If it rains and softens the soil, they'll move out of the colony into sandy soil, and the larvae reproduce by creating these little pupariums. I don't know the proper term, but they create a little area in the soil where the larvae twist around and create this. They pupate. If the soil conditions are warm, 30 degrees or better, in 13 days they can complete this cycle and come back out and go looking for new colonies. So can be a fairly rapid life cycle, but the key part is they will mass in the colony. This is a time when if you found a colony that's a dead out that has some damage from small hive beetle, sometimes the larvae will be on the bottom board, and you can actually kill them with bleach or soapy water. But once they move into the soil, this is where people have targeted insecticides. I don't think it's necessary, but you could treat the soil with a pyrethroid, I think, in the soil. I never do that. And then what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of trapping that you can do of adults in the colony. But that's the life cycle. A graduate student of mine and Dewey Cairns at the University of Delaware, just to give you an idea of how many larvae can reproduce, we took single brood frames and let the beetles have their lunch, if you will. So we put single brood frames with no bees on it, and we were producing about 6,000 larvae per brood frame. And so if you do the math on that, you can get a lot of small hive beetle if they have complete free range, and that's what we call mass reproduction. So if the colony dies out or it absconds and brood and pollen is left behind, you can generate a lot of small hive beetle larvae. There's also another thing called cryptic reproduction. Peter Neumann and colleagues described this. It's where they're reproducing a little bit in the corners, and a few larvae make it, and they drop out of the colony without being seen, and they go in the ground. So, and that does happen. You get this low level of reproduction. And what's happening? This is the mass reproduction. That's all small hive beetle larvae. I'm dumping them in soapy water, and that's at least 20 or 30,000 small hive beetle larvae. That's a very worst case scenario. I've only created that experimentally. I've never seen it in my hives, et cetera. So this is a scare tactic. And I talked about rain triggering migration. We learned that from this master's student work. We put these nuke boxes up. The small hive beetle produced like 6,000 larvae per nuke box, and we were monitoring. We had pans of water under them, and we monitored them every day. And only after a rain event did they migrate out of the nukes. So it was pretty cool. Unfortunately, it's never been published, but but we know that, and that makes sense because it softens the ground, and they can move into the ground. This is something I'd like you to conceptually think about a beehive as the bees are in here. This is the center of the brood nest. You've got pollen all around the brood and on combs nearby, and you've got honey, on the margins. The beetles are sitting there trying to get access into here. That's what the beetles are trying to do. The bees are trying to push them to the margins. So when you look at a colony with small hive beetles, you'll find beetles on the top and on the bottom board, and you'll find them on the peripheral combs. Also, if you caught Peter Neumann's talk yesterday, he briefly mentioned social encapsulation. I wrote it up there. It's when the bees push the beetles into the corner, they create these nice little propolis traps. Literally, they're little propolis prisons, I should say. That's the good news. So they herd them into the corner of a frame. They create a little propolis prison. You've got 10 beetles in there. Now for the bad news. They're in prison, but the bees will feed them. So the beetles are in this little prison, and they walk to the door, and they literally antonate the bees, and the bees give them food. So the beetles have figured out how to live with bees. But what the bees are successful because if they can keep them away from brood and pollen in these prisons, you're fine. You don't have beetle reproduction. What happens when we as beekeepers go into our colony? We break up those prisons. So when I lift up my inner cover, I can see the prisons. I can see the little propolis walls of the prison. I can see the beetles, and then they take off and run around. So we as beekeepers disrupt the natural system that's in place to kind of keep beetles at bay. But it's not a perfect system, but it does occur, and it's because the beetles are out here on the periphery, they're trying to get access, and the bees are pushing them to the margins. Yeah, and this is just a comb. Yeah, here's the brood, here's the pollen. You're going to find beetles out here in the corners or up here on the margins, and the bees are actually pretty effective at keeping them pushed away. The other thing that's really difficult, if you work your colony and you turn a frame the wrong way, and there's a bit of burr comb, they'll get larvae started where there's not enough bee space that the bees can get in there and clean things out. So working your colony with small hive beetles, you want to be careful to put everything back in its correct order. Environmental factors, cold and soil moisture have a huge impact on small hive beetle success, a huge impact. And I'll just talk briefly about some of that. Soil type, they like soft, sandy soil. As you go from soft, sandy soil to more loamy soil, especially to clay, when you get to clay, harder soils, their success rate goes down. So they're very successful in moist, sandy soil. Yep. And this is an example. I would put larvae in sandy soil. This was all done with sandy soil and held them at different temperatures. I held them at 30 degrees, 20 degrees, and 10 degrees. And this is the days in the soil versus the number of beetles that emerged. Basically, this is about 98% of the beetles that I put in emerged in 22 days. So they emerged fairly quickly. Look at the time lag. The 20 degrees, they didn't emerge until about day 32. So you can see that cooler soil temperatures have an impact. 10 degrees is out here somewhere, they never emerged. So cold soil, they don't like. That's why Canada is not that threatened or whatever. If you combine this, the fact that they reproduce really well at warm soil temperatures, and soil moisture, where their problem in the U.S. is the southeastern U.S., where you have warm temperatures year-round, and you also have a lot of sandy soil. If you move to the western U.S., it's dry. It's dry most of the time. If you move north in the U.S., it's colder. You have cold soil. So through experience and through everything else, and because of their nature of the beetle, we have trouble in the southeastern U.S. And I'm above that a bit. I'm in what we call the mid-Atlantic. So yeah, temperature below 10 degrees C in the soil, they didn't reproduce. Sand is better than loam and clay. And then soil moisture, less than 5%, you don't get much beetle emergence. And you can get soil that's too wet. They can't take soil that's too wet. In the honey house, when beetles first come into an area, in the honey house, the beekeepers have a bit of an education to undergo, and I'll tell you why. I told you they needed brood or pollen to reproduce, right? I use queen excluders, and the reason I use queen excluders is occasionally I'll get a little pollen up in my brood, in my honey, but I never get brood up there. But let's say you don't use queen excluders. You still, when you harvest your honey, you cannot let it sit with small hive beetle around. Because within 3 to 5 days, you'll have young larvae, and within 10 days, you'll have a mess. So if you're harvesting honey in small hive beetle areas, what you need to do is harvest it, don't store it, and go ahead and extract it. So it becomes routine. It's not a big deal. The other thing you can do, and this is some work we did in Florida, here's a commercial beekeeper. Look at all this honey. They may not be able to process it quickly enough. So reducing the moisture in that area, the ambient moisture in the honey house, below 50%, will slow down the beetle's reproduction somewhat. So drying, not really drying the honey, but drying the area that the honey is stored in. But the best thing is just to rapidly extract it. We did some other experiments because you want to think about how long beetles can live in transit or how do they move around. So I did what I call a starvation experiment. And I'm going to put adult beetles on water only, queen candy only, or no water and no candy. So I've got 3 different treatments. I also will point out that if I feed them on honey, honey was my control when I was doing a lot of experiments. I had 1 female beetle that lived for over 12 months. If they're not laying, as soon as they start laying eggs, they'll die in 3 or 4 weeks. They'll lay themselves out. But the adult beetle can live a long time. So now I want to starve them. I want to give them water only, candy only, or nothing. And I want to look at their survival. So these are days of starting the experiment. And both candy and nothing, they basically died, and by 4 days, all my beetles were dead. So they do need water to survive. They don't necessarily need sugar or anything. So here they're taking water only, and they live for between 11 and 12 days. They start to die in my experiment. I'm going, well, I put them to the point of starvation. Can they still be reproductive? So now what I did, the black arrow is when I started to feed them diet. 9 of the beetles I give diet on day 12. And you'll see, after giving them a diet of pollen, the first 24 hours they laid a few eggs. This is eggs per female in 24 hours. But look, by 48 hours, 2 days later, after they had access to pollen or brood, I could have used brood, they started laying right away. So they can be at the point of starvation and still be productive. And so they were very productive. And this is just the egg viability. So this is percent of egg hatch, and it was always pushing 90%. So these eggs were viable. So these queens, I've done a lot of work on queens, sorry. These female beetles, they were at the point of starvation, but they can recover rapidly, even at that stress level. I mentioned Peter Neumann a lot, and the reason is Peter and I go way back. I was at the Beltsville Bee Lab for a number of years, and I had a group of scientists come over from Peter's lab to work on small hive beetle because it wasn't in Europe yet at that time. And so these are just some of the names. And Mark Schaefer is the one pictured here, Mark Schaefer, and this is Dorothy Hoffman and the technician Andy at the lab. And what does that look like? It looks like a bunch of mad scientists. And I mean, it looked like something out of a movie, and that's exactly what it was. I'll explain it in a minute. Mark now is the head of the German bee diagnostic lab. So Mark has gone on to be the head of the disease lab in Germany. But so what we're trying to do is figure out, I told you the beetles need access into the brood. We've got a bunch of nukes and things that we've manipulated in different ways. We want to find out where the beetles are in the colony. And if we go into a colony, they start moving about. So we thought, what if we froze the whole colony? And the only way to quickly freeze the whole colony is with liquid nitrogen. So we're literally, it is a wild experiment. We're just literally taking the nuke box, we got beetles in there, and we're lowering it into liquid nitrogen. The idea is that we would freeze them, like freeze everyone in place. And it worked. And so then Mark's got a couple of publications out from some of this work, but basically you find beetles on the margins, and the bees are doing a pretty good job of keeping them at the margins. So this becomes important in trapping. Where are the beetles in your colony? And I'll show you a bit more of that. These are some of the things I want to say about what I think are still research gaps in a sense. We know a lot about beetle and bee interactions, but I think there's more to go on. That social encapsulation is one powerful thing. But how do they get introduced across large areas? Probably through some kind of trade, human trade. We don't know how far they can fly, and do they move readily in swarms? We think they do. Improved diagnostics, I'll say a bit more about that. And then a bit more in control, but again, good beekeeping practices, you can keep these beetles under control. About the diagnostic level, Mark, when he was in lab, Mark Schaefer, he has a little strip that's named after him. It's called the Schaefer strip. And what it is plastic corrugated sign material. The little sign material is about that thick. It's corrugated. You put a strip of that on the bottom board. The beetles crawl in there to hide. Clear plastic. You pull it out after 24 hours, and you quickly count the beetles that are there. It's a fairly good survey tool. So it's very quick. You don't have to open the hive. That's the Schaefer strip. The other thing, which I hope is coming up next, is, the Schaefer strips are these Swiffer towels. And this came out of Australia, out of some beekeeper initiative where the beekeeper figured out what they were doing. Like, hey, how can I trap these beetles more effectively? I'm going to show a picture of that in a minute. But yeah, the Schaefer strips are literally a piece of plastic corrugated cardboard, if you will. And you just slide it in the entrance and pull it out. And they work, and there's papers out there on that. I have to get to the Swiffer things in just a minute because I'm going to go through a couple of things about dealing with a small hive beetle. I've already touched on that. Extract in 3 to 5 days, otherwise you get damage. If you can pull your honey without brood or pollen, but often that's not you don't do that. If you don't use excluders, you're going to get some brood, and they'll go right after that brood. I do use queen excluders. You can reduce the humidity to less than 50% where you're storing the honey. It'll help. It won't eliminate beetles. I've never done this, but they do go in this larval stage. They will go to light traps. If you have wandering larvae, which these are called, they're fully mature. If they come out of the honey, you can use a light trap through the nighttime, and they'll move to a light trap. You get your wet supers. Let's say you've extracted it in less than 5 days, but you've got a bunch of wet supers. There's usually some pollen cells in there. If you store those wet supers and don't get them back on bees, they'll reproduce in that little bit of pollen. So get your wet supers back out and get them cleaned up. And then if you have a serious thing in your apiary or around your honey house where you know larvae have been moved to the soil, you can treat the soil. And GuardStar is the commercial name of the product that's approved in the US. It's a pyrethroid. How do beekeepers deal with it? And this is, again, I don't use any chemical treatment. Keep strong hives. That, it kind of goes without saying. If you have colonies that are getting weak, don't leave them in the yard, kind of combine them with something else if you have a lot of beetle pressure. When you make a nuke, when you make a split, make sure you have a high bee to brood ratio. You don't want to have too much brood in that nuke because the bees can't protect it, and you'll get damage when you make splits. So that's this high. That's as high. No extra comb. If you don't need extra comb on the colony, don't have it. But when you make splits, make sure you have less brood and more bees. Oh, this is an oddity, but it's true. Keep hives in the sun versus the shade. I've got yards, apiaries, where half the yard is in the sun and half the yard is in the shade, or more or less during the day. You'll find more beetles in the shaded colony. And we don't understand it, but it's true. If you have a really shady yard and you can find a nearby location that's more sunny, you'll support less beetles. All right, very quickly about trapping. So there's this thing called the West trap, and I think this is a picture of it. You have to have your hives exactly level, and you pour a bunch of oil, mineral oil, in this tray. This is a queen extruder, or not queen extruder, a mesh material that doesn't allow the bees to go through there, but the beetles will go down in there and try to hide, get away from the bees, and they'll drown in the oil. It works. It's messy. I don't know many people that use it, but it does work because the beetles are trying to get away from the bees. And again, they're using oil, just a vegetable oil, but it's just messy. The hood trap, I think this is the hood trap. There's different traps where you put vinegar and different baits to draw them in. There's something called beetle blaster, which I don't have a picture of. It goes between the frames. The beetles, adult beetles will move in there. And then this is one on the bottom board. It's that corrugated plastic cardboard I was talking about. The beetles like to move into the grooves. And here they're putting coumaphos in there, which is a chemical I don't like at all. But the beetles crawl in, and they contact the coumaphos, and it does kill them. So this is oh, there it is. Yeah, the coumaphos trap is easy, but yeah, chance for resistance. And it's just, coumaphos is an organic phosphate, and it's a dangerous chemical. But again, you're taking advantage of the fact the beetles are on the bottom board. They're on the bottom board here trying to get, and they hide in the oil. Here they're between the frames, but all these traps work to some degree. Some beekeepers in Australia came up with this idea called the Swiffer towel, or whatever they want to call it. It's a simple towel. I have one down here that as you put it in the top of the colony, this is the top of the brood box, the bees begin to chew it up, and the beetles are up here running around as well, and I don't have a picture of entangled beetles in this, but the beetles become entangled in the towel and literally just die. So it's non-chemical, it's easy to use, and I use these in my hives. I said every one of my hives has beetles, so I put these in the top, just top part of the hive. I come back whenever I go back to the colony, 5 days, 3 weeks later, and I scrape these off and put new ones on. So it's very low impact, very low cost, and they do work. How much they reduce the beetle population, I don't know, but they work well enough that I have yet to see any damage in 3 years of having bees in a sandy area. So, yeah, they do work. All right, so we're going to shift gears, and to shift gears, I'm gonna move across the stage, and I warned the cameraman I'm gonna change positions because if you've ever been to a tennis match, you notice that no one ever goes to sleep in a tennis match, and that's because they're sitting there and they're going like this. They're watching the ball, so you can't go to sleep. And if I come over here, I have much better eye contact with some of the people on this side. So I'm going to speak from this side just a few minutes, and then I'll probably move back to finish over there. And I'm going to do a shameless promotion of my own operation. This has 100 to 150 hives. That was when I was doing pollination of watermelons and pumpkins. I'm trying to get out of the pollination business because bees don't do well in watermelons because there's no nectar and pollen, and they use a lot of fungicides. But this is my youngest son, Kevin, who helps with the operation. Occasionally we produce this award-winning comb honey, but not that often. I keep all my hives on trailers, almost all of them, and it allows me to move them around very easily, and it saves my back. And that's the main reason. And then our honey, we sell at two local markets, and it's just Chesapeake honey, and we call it spring honey and summer or fall honey. We don't get enough of a consistent flow to call it anything else. We get blackberry, acacia, and holly trees. The holly trees are really important for us. But anyway, And so I'm transitioning, but there was another thing I was going to say. Oh, yeah, I was just going to repeat that I've got small hive beetles, and it's not, small hive beetles aren't really a problem for me. They're a nuisance. They are a nuisance, but they're not. I'm much more worried about varroa, and I'm worried about pesticide exposure, et cetera. And honey flows. I'm worried about honey flows. So now we're going to shift and go to climate change. It's been mentioned by almost every other speaker I've heard in this thing. So I'm just going to touch on some of the things that I think are happening. And some of this is totally out of our control. But if you think about it, some of the new pests, even small hive beetle, it benefits by warmer temperatures. Tropolaelaps, if you've heard it, and you'll hear Maggie Gill, I think, will speak on Sunday about Tropolaelaps. It's a tropical mite pest, but it's probably going to do better as bees don't continue to rear brood through the winter, and I'll leave it at that. I don't think I talked more about that. But a lot of our issues with climate change have to do with changing in flowering patterns and the availability of nectar. So I'll touch on some of that. This picture is from Greece. This is from, and I wasn't there. I actually had to buy this photo. I never buy a photo, but I love this photo so much. I mean, not that I love what was happening. I love the impact. Like, we are susceptible to climate change. And I'll talk about flooding and fires and stuff like that. You really do need to think about your apiary location, because you might be in an area where, oh, it hasn't flooded in 50 years there, but think seriously, because we're getting these really intense thunderstorms and stuff. And this is in Greece, the wildfires. And the other thing is, I finished this part of the talk, is that everything is connected. And here, obviously, the environment drives what bees do. And then we have to respond to that as beekeepers. So there's a lot of direct effects of climate change. I'll show you something about reduced honey production, study in Chile. The second one, reduction in pollen quality, is some of my own work with other colleagues. And then Tropolaelaps range expansion, I won't touch on very much, but I could. So direct effects, you've got things like fires. And you've heard all the stories from different fires in different parts of the world. I live in the east coast of the US. The fires in Canada were in British Columbia and Alberta, which is all the way on the west coast. We got smoke. We had smoke that we could detect from the wildfires all the way across the country. So, but I mean, there's some major issues with wildfires. Obviously, dry conditions or drought conditions, things getting warmer, and irregular rainfall can be a big issue. This is a study, it is my own study. I and a group out of Canada, Allie McPhee she's a very good writer, by the way. If you read some of the work, she was a postdoc, and this is a group out of British Columbia, Dave Tarpey and myself. We've done a lot on queen quality, and we were finding that sperm viability was damaged by low temperatures and high temperatures. So this is a summary paper of a lot of that work. We shipped queens around, and we were worried about shipment during different temperatures, and cold and warm temperatures. But Allie looked at all the work, and she had this range of between 15, which is not that low, and 38. Below that and above that, you're going to get damage to the sperm viability in queens. You also think about drones. And drones, what's happening in the summer in many areas of the world, just climate change, but just temperature. A lot of times during the midsummer, you're getting temperatures way above 38. You're getting 42 and 45 sometimes. So those drones could be sterilized in those colonies. Not so much the queen. The queen is protected in the colony, and they keep the colony cool. But I'm worried about the drones. And I would put this number, that's not very cold. That's 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 C. So if you've got queens in the spring that you've ordered and moving around, you need to make sure they maintain some degree of warmth. This is what I was talking about with rain patterns. This is a hurricane hitting the east coast of the U.S. This is South Carolina. This is North Carolina. I keep my bees right here on this. It's called the Eastern Shore. Here's Washington, D.C. in this area. My bees are right in that area. But erratic rainfall can be a major issue. This is a study from Chile that I was talking about. They did a 10-year analysis of 2 different regions in Chile, and the take-home message was that there was declining honey production and exports related to temperature and precipitation in those regions. So they were able to document that, yeah, we have erratic honey production, right? But what is it linked to? And they linked it to the amount of rainfall and the dry conditions. I'm going to move back over because I want to check the time. Yep. So make sure I might be long-winded. I'm okay for now? All right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And yeah. So that's a study, just some documentation of climate change issues. This doesn't look like much, but it's the most important. It's my only take-home message. Well, other than small hive beetles aren't going to put you out of business. Small hive beetles won't put you out of business. And this is saying, don't go by what you learned from your mentor. I know that sounds crazy, but if you're third generation beekeeper, and that beekeeper and his father or mother, for 3 generations, they said, always super on May 1st. You got to super on May 1st. Don't super on May 1st. Look at your bees. That's the take-home message is, look at your bees. In one of the series we were talking about, how many people have fed their colonies in midsummer? I don't like feeding bees, yeah, but we never used to have to feed bees in the midsummer. Now it's getting drier. So the same thing about all of the things that we've learned about do this exactly this time, it can shift year to year. So that's what this is meant to say. Look in your bees, know what they're doing, and adapt accordingly. So I'll tell you quickly about this rising CO2 levels, which is climate change, and pollen quality, a study that I was involved in while I was at Beltsville. We wanted to pick a plant that produced pollen that the bees were going to use to produce winter bees. And we chose solidago, which is goldenrod, Solidago canadensis. So we had this good fall pollen source, and we're going to look at one plant and see if the protein quality in that solidago had changed over time. How do we do that? Well, there's the reference for it. Luckily, we had the Smithsonian Institute right there in Washington, and we could go there, and in their herbarium, where they have plants preserved from 1842, I think, I'll see it in a minute, we have really old preserved solidago plants coming forward, and we can look at that over time. So there's the Smithsonian, 1842 to 2014, we sampled 350 plants spanning 172 years, is that right? If the math is right. We were able to take a small amount of pollen and look at the protein content. We also have the meteorological data to see how the CO2 had changed over that time period. So this is just the historic data. Then we grew in these tunnels, we grew solidago from high CO2 down to low CO2 to see if we could experimentally see what we had in that. And this is nitrogen, and nitrogen level was increasing in the pollen, but this is the estimated protein. This is what we're really interested in. Estimated protein, this is really over years. I know it doesn't say years, but it's the years. So if you start in the 1840s here, you had low CO2 in the 280s to 300. And you see how many samples we have up to about 1920 probably. We have a lot of samples here. We have fewer samples here, but the trend is really obvious. Higher CO2, this group right here compared to that group, it was highly significant. So 18% protein, about 18% versus down to almost 12%. It's a 30% reduction in protein. So what does that do to our bees? I don't know. We didn't do any further feeding studies. But what I do know is that this is a very important fall pollen to build up winter bees. So if they're getting 30% less protein, it's going to have an effect. It's going to have an effect. And this was only done with one plant species. So what's happening with some of the other plant species? We actually don't know. I'll play devil's advocate a bit. Some plants actually really benefit from rising CO2. Poison ivy being one of them. So poison ivy, it grows better with rising CO2. But solidago, goldenrod, in this case, the pollen had less protein in it. So we need to think about spring buildup, fall pollens, et cetera, and just be aware of how climate change can change your spring buildup. You're doing things like splits and all based on when things start flowering. The same in the fall. You're trying to produce winter bees, and you need to be aware of, is it early spring or late spring, that kind of thing. So, yeah, what are some of the signals going into fall that know that you can get good winter bee production? So, I've talked a little bit about flooding, droughts, fires as direct effects. Some of the indirect effects, things like lower honey yields, winter bees, broodless periods, those are harder to detect and harder to see. So we're kind of unaware of some of those. But again, as beekeepers, we need to think about how things are shifting in our area. I talked about the Chilean study, reduced CO2 in the goldenrod study. And what I want to kind of summarize with is that the bees will adapt. The bees will adapt to the changing environment. And we as beekeepers need to watch what the bees are doing and adapt our management accordingly. So again, don't just go by the calendar that you've gone for year after year. And yeah. So, but how does climate change fit in all these other things that we've got, right? I mean, we've got a whole list of problems. And it's something that we physically actually can't do much about. Here's just some of the other things that we're dealing with, right? Some of these we can act on. But I'm just saying climate change is this big overarching thing that will affect some of these other things, especially varroa and other pests like small hive beetle. It might not directly affect honey prices, but it'll directly affect honey production. Okay, so connections. The bees are connected to the environment. They respond very quickly to incoming things like spring pollen. So that's the bees' response. The beekeepers then need to respond to what the bees are doing. And this is actually in Korea. This is feeding protein and when to feed syrup and things. So we have to adapt our practices feeding syrup in the summer. Actually, I'll make one little sideline if I have a couple of more minutes. Yep. One more quick story. This is a protein patty, right, that they're feeding to bees. And in some areas, that's becoming more common. I started the lecture on small hive beetle. Small hive beetle, and that equals beetle reproduction. It's like, oh boy, because the bees are down here and they're feeding in the thing, but the beetles can get under there and make a mess. And so when you start feeding protein in an area with small hive beetle, I very seldom have to feed protein, but you put on smaller patties that they can consume in a short period of time. There's also, I'm still in research. Research can help solve problems. There's a fellow in Georgia that's working, and he's got a compound, which is, I don't know that it's not, it may or may not be organic, but there's a compound that seems to be non-toxic to bees that we can add to the protein and stop beetle reproduction. So to me, that's a really good thing, because you can put your pollen patty on and not have to worry about small hive beetle reproduction. So that's a kind of a win-win. And that should be coming on the market in the next couple of years. He's got a patent pending on it and stuff. But again, it's something that if you just use normal protein patties, you'll generate a lot of small hive beetles. So, but anyway, as beekeepers, we're responding to what the bees are doing or their needs. Do they need syrup? Do they need protein? That kind of thing. And then we need to make sure that we're selling this story that humans are kind of dependent on the bees because That's a third of our food supply. So we as beekeepers need to do a good job of selling that story. Because I think you've heard, we probably lost maybe 1.5 million colonies in the U.S. this year. Large losses, back like colony collapse disorder, which I was heavily involved in 20 years ago. And symptoms look similar, they may not be the same, but it's just going to be a bunch of factors coming together. They always say, oh, what's causing it? Everything. A little bit of varroa, a little bit of pesticides, a little bit of poor nutrition. Poor nutrition is critical. So anyway, but why should the broader audience care? Why should they support beekeeping and bee inspection or whatever? It's because of what bees do to put food in the environment. So yeah, and that's a strawberry blossom. So we need to do a good job of selling that. And again, in your beekeeping, I would just say, be flexible. If you want to hear more talks and more from all over the globe, I invite you to Copenhagen in September of 23 of this year to Apimondia. We have over 1,000 talks submitted, and we're going to probably have maybe 300 presentations and tons of posters. And then if you don't make Copenhagen, you can think about Tanzania in 27 for our 50th Congress, because we're a very old organization. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. Bang on time. Right, I'm sure we have time for a few questions, so please raise your hands.
They need to get to the trade show before it closes.
Over there, yes. Yep.
Can I ask whether the fact that small hive beetle needs pollen as one of its requirements for reproduction is affecting any breeding programs for bees in the US?
Like just the bee breeding programs. The way it's affecting the bee breeding programs is that the small mating nukes are very vulnerable to small hive beetles, so because of their size.
I don't mean actually within the hive, I mean in producing queens. Are you looking to breed queens that maybe produce products which bring in pollen but don't use it directly without storing or something?
No, not to my knowledge. Yeah. But they are. When I said they're a problem in this, they're a problem in the southeastern U.S. Where's the U.S.? Here, southeastern U.S. And there's some queen breeders there. There's a lot of queen breeders in California. It's drier. They don't have issues with small hive beetle. Yeah. Yes.
I don't know which is more surprising, that the honeybee imprisons the small hive beetle, or the small hive beetle attenuates the honey so it gets fed. Were you surprised by this? Has it been seen anywhere else?
I don't know that. So Jamie Ellis at University of Florida. So the question was about the imprisonment, the social encapsulation in these little propolis prisons. If you search it, you can see some video of it. It's fascinating. Peter Neumann published on it, and so did Jamie Ellis, almost at the same time. And yes, you got 5 beetles in this little prison, and there's 2 little openings, and they walk out there, and the bees are checking, and when they antenate it, they feed them. It's pretty fascinating, yeah.
Some of my hives will produce or collect far too much pollen, and you'll have whole frames that are, presumably with a small hive beetle, the best thing we can do is get rid of those, because it's a good territory. The protein, there isn't any brood in it hardly.
I can tell you another secret, which I didn't touch on because it gets almost too much in the weeds. Stored pollen is not nearly as good at starting beetle larvae as brood. If they get a little bit of access to spring chilled brood on the margins of your comb, so that dry panel of pollen, the bees are pretty good about protecting that. It's when you get a little bit of brood that's exposed by a piece of burr comb or something. That's where I call them hot spots, where the beetles start laying eggs. So don't get rid of your pollen frames. Keep strong. It means you've got strong bees. Strong bees can protect the brood nest, and I didn't point it out enough. If you've got doubles or even a single box, before the honey flow, don't leave 4 or 5 stacked empty supers up there. It gives the beetles too much places to hide. So keep them kind of compact, but then as soon as don't let them swarm either. So there's a timing thing there. But no, I would not get rid of pollen because they'll go for brood first. There's also the same group, there's some fascinating, the beetles come along and they open a little hole in the capping. They lay an egg in there in developing larvae or pupae. And then the bees can sense it, they'll open it back up, clean out the eggs, and then recap it. So there's this constant battle going on. The beetles trying to get in and get places to lay eggs. And if the bees are good, they're strong, they can combat small hive beetle. They're from Africa, and the African subspecies are really clean. They do a lot of good hygienic stuff. And that's why they're in most nests I've seen in Africa. And you'll find them, but they don't cause damage because the bees are protecting the nest enough, and they'll protect your pollen.
Yep.
Yep.
I don't know whether I could be complacent. I live in the Midlands in South Derbyshire, where it's wet and cold, and I live on clay. How adaptable are small hive beetle becoming, or can I just...
You can forget, they won't be a problem. No, I don't know the soil types enough, but you've got a lot of things. If you've got cold and wet, heavy soils, they don't do well. I talk about the growing season for small hive beetle. Like in my area, the growing season is about 6 or 8 months long almost. The soil's warm enough. But as soon as you get north in the US, the growing season is only like, 2.5, 3 months. So you're probably in the same situation. Use these Swiffer towels, if you ever get here, use the Swiffer towels. I didn't point out enough real quickly. They came into Italy over 10 years ago. And they're in very southern Italy. And they haven't moved, which is amazing. And we think it's either intervention from the Pope, that's one strategy, or it's something about the climate. I think it's the climate, and Peter Norman touched on this. It's dry in that area of southern Italy. And there's a little bit of mountain range. I think they haven't moved, which is incredible. But they will eventually move. But they also like moisture, so yeah.
Like the varroa, do the small hive beetles prefer to lay their eggs in drone, the large cells, or worker, or both?
They'll lay their eggs anywhere in the hive, actually. They'll lay them in little cracks and crevices. They don't have to lay it in the brood necessarily. So like on this pollen frame, they may lay in a little area and hope that the larvae can hatch and get into the pollen before the bees discover them. So no, there's no preference for drone brood over worker brood. They do prefer brood if they can get in there. Yeah.
Coming to the end. On the subject of the small hive beetle in Britain, there has been modelling done by the National Bee Unit, which suggests that, maybe the wetter parts of Derbyshire aren't a lovely place for the small hive beetle, but unfortunately there are parts of the UK that could be more suitable and so on. So it's something we need to take care to and keep vigilant on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.